I'm Susan McGinnis with Clean Skies News. We're talking climate negotiations today with G8 and major economies forums meetings happening this week in Italy, following UN talks in Bonn, talks still to come in Barcelona and Bangkok. The run-up to Copenhagen is certainly well underway. Well, a global environmental organization called RARE, based in Arlington, Virginia, works with environmental and conservation groups around the world, and climate talks going on right now certainly figure greatly into its efforts. With me now is Jenks. He is CEO of RARE. Brett, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Now, a couple of big agreements are apparently coming out of G8 and MEF out of Italy, having to do with financing of climate measures in the developing world, also wider issues like mitigation and adaptation. I just want to get your take on whether what you see being accomplished at all of these climate negotiations in the run-up to Copenhagen are happening or going to be happening to the satisfaction of groups like yours with what you're working on.
I think the environmental community is going to have a mixed review, as always, of the state of these negotiations and their outcomes. For RARE in particular, we're really pleased to see one issue in particular that's coming to the forefront, and that is this question of deforestation and the role that forests...
Only recently has it really become a top-tier issue in these talks.
Only a year ago in Bali were negotiators really beginning these early discussions about the role forests play in climate change and what we can all do to take advantage of avoiding deforestation to reduce greenhouse gases.
So what do you think is going to happen among the world leaders' decisions when it comes to deforestation that can work its way into these actual documents? Do you like what you saw in the Bonn draft that is about deforestation? How do you think that'll figure into your work?
Well, we don't spend a lot of time at the negotiating table, obviously. This is for the governments to figure out. What we see coming out, though, is a clear indication that forests are not only on the agenda, they're going to play a critical component. And what's particularly exciting being here in Washington, D.C. is the fact that the Waxman-Markey bill also is providing lead indication that forests will be a part of U.S. climate policy as well. So there's obviously these forces are coming to a head. Looking ahead to Copenhagen, this means the U.S. may show up with at least some language that talks about the role of forests in climate.
Right, and will it be considered an offset, which you assume will be? So how does that translate into the work you're doing on the ground around the world?
Well, there's some really important questions about forests and about climate change. And once you recognize that 20% of greenhouse gases stem from deforestation, most of which is in tropical nations, you can begin to see why it's so important that we work together with developing nations to tackle these problems of deforestation. There's numerous benefits to taking that approach, but there are also numerous challenges. In many of these countries in which we're working, in Indonesia and South America, questions about land tenure become a big problem. Who owns the forest? Is it the governments? Is it municipalities? Is it the local inhabitants of these forests? Land tenure becomes a challenge. What kinds of financial mechanisms are going to be validated globally and then nationally that will enable us to either pay offsets here in the United States, corporations or individuals, or to have governments begin to compensate other governments for their efforts to reduce deforestation.
Right. So the who pays, I mean, that's really the main issue at the talks this week and coming up.
And these are complicated questions.
Yeah, they definitely are. So what else are you guys working with? I know you do. You actually help provide financing to help indigenous groups around the world to help them conserve. Tell us more about your work.
Well, within the context of climate change, we liken the future of avoided deforestation to what we've learned trying to protect national parks all over the world over the last 20 years. And if you recognize it, maybe this is a leap, but if you recognize that there are over 100 national parks, 100,000 national parks around the world, and most of them are just parks on paper. Our fear is that these carbon deals, as we start to set up carbon forests, provide carbon offset payments to set aside forests so that they can sequester carbon and serve their natural purpose, that there will be the same kinds of challenges affecting those places as national parks in the developing world today. And anybody who's traveled to remote rural areas of high biodiversity in the tropics can see these local communities chipping away at conservation gains, overfishing, poaching, slash and burn agriculture, all of which will end up reducing any gains we make in reducing greenhouse gases. So what we're really trying to do is work to develop models and prototypes that prove that this can work, that communities can benefit from avoided deforestation, that we can account for the carbon, that we can sustainably manage these financial mechanisms to make this work.
And because all that starts now in Italy and later in Copenhagen, are you guys actively trying to influence policy?
Well, RARE's not. We're a small organization that spends its time on the ground in these rural communities. We're counting on our bigger institutional partners and the governments to work out the policy deals. But at the end of the day, that's policy. And as we know in the environmental field, policy is one thing. What happens in the field is often quite different. So we're going to have to be building a ground game for conservation in the developing tropics at the local level to ensure that avoided deforestation actually works.
Right. And one of your messages, I know, is that not only does the industrialized world need to take action, but it has to happen in the developing world as well.
Yeah. And one of the things we're hoping the things that we're hoping for out of Copenhagen are, one, that industrialized nations set limits and establish clear targets for reducing emissions. Two, that the developing nations of the world can determine in their own appropriate way what best serves their needs in terms of mitigation. Third, that there's financing. Yeah. And fourth, that there's an institutional governing arrangement that enables these deals to take place. Because one big concern is that national governments, let's say in Indonesia or in Mexico, Brazil, Papua New Guinea, national governments will benefit, but the people inhabiting these areas won't. Yeah. And the fact is, if people don't benefit locally, what incentive will they have for protecting that forest, which represent 20% of greenhouse gas emissions?
And that comes from the world leaders. There's actually some talk that a draft out of the Major Economies Forum tomorrow is actually considering dropping hard numerical targets. Does that concern you?
I think there's going to be a lot of ebb and flow.
Even the 80% by 2050 may not end up in there.
Yeah, that would be disconcerting. And I think that the challenge is, this is a framework. The UNFCCC is a framework. We've got to get this started. So I think there's going to be a lot of ebb and flow in these policy negotiations between now and Copenhagen. And there will be many more changes after Copenhagen. But our focus is on demonstrating that it can work in the field. There's only a few pilot initiatives in RED, reduced emissions from degradation and deforestation, around the world, and we're working with a number of partners to be pioneers to prove to the policymakers over the next few years that this can work. Once that proof is in place, communities being paid, provided an incentive to not deforest, it serves the same role as those initial scrubbers that started cleaning smokestacks years ago. And
you're encouraged so far with what you're seeing in these talks and legislation that's moving through so far?
We are cautiously optimistic, I think, as anybody is. Yeah. Just look at the velocity of change over the last couple of years, and just look at the discussions we're currently having now as a nation and as a global community. These discussions weren't taking place 2 years ago. These governments weren't committed to many of these issues 12 months ago. This is a big shift, especially here in the States.
Well, you're certainly doing some important work there at RARE. Brett Jenks, thank you so much for coming in, and we hope we'll see you again.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks a lot. And I'm Susan McGinnis, Clean Skies News.